The afternoon sun streamed through the thin curtains of the small house in Maplewood, Ohio, casting a golden light across the antique hardwood floors. The room was filled with children's voices, laughter, and the sweet scent of freshly made frosting. Everything seemed perfect, the kind of scene anyone would describe as a picture of happiness. In the center of the table, a three-tiered cake covered in flawless white frosting and decorated with tiny, colorful stars bore the name Eli in sugar letters. It was the 9th birthday of a reserved boy, with a deep, silent gaze, as if bearing the weight of something not even adults could understand. As the guests waited anxiously to sing happy birthday, a sudden stillness began to spread. Eli remained motionless, arms crossed, staring at the cake as if he saw something hidden beneath its sweet surface. His stepfather, Marcus, tried to mask the tension with a forced joke, but his voice faltered. Even the house's normally calm old Labrador began to growl softly, his fur standing on end, his gaze fixed on the same spot as the boy. Grace, his mother, noticed the discomfort and with a trembling smile crouched down before her son, trying to coax him into blowing out the candles. The boy didn't answer. He just murmured something so low only his mother heard. "Don't cut that cake, Mommy. Please." The air seemed to stagnate. The children fell silent, and even the candles seemed to burn more slowly. Marcus put his hand on the boy's shoulder, trying to force him closer, but Eli fixed him with a look that mixed fear and revulsion, a look no one in that room would ever forget. Then, in a firm voice, he said, "He put something in there." The silence that followed was terrifying. And in that instant, everyone knew something terrible was about to happen. The only question was, what exactly had Eli seen inside that cake? And why did Marcus look so nervous? If this introduction has already made you curious, subscribe now and leave a like, because what comes next is even more intense than you imagined. The city of Maplewood, not inside Ohio, had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets seemed to die along with the autumn leaves. Narrow streets, lined with ancient trees, held wooden houses painted in pale tones, where time seemed to move more slowly. The house of Carter, it sat at the end of one such street, near an abandoned field that children avoided at dusk. Neighbors described it as modest but welcoming, and Grace made a point of keeping the yard tidy, as if that veneer of normalcy could hide the invisible cracks that were beginning to open up within. Grace Carter was a woman in her early 30s with a sweet face, but eyes marked by an old weariness. She worked as a nurse in a local hospital and supported her family with effort. Since she had married Marcus, an attractive man with a firm voice, believed he had finally found the stability life had always denied him. But there was something about Marcus that never suited the calm environment of Maplewood. He was too reserved, spoke little about the past, and had a controlling way of being present, as if every word he said was to be obeyed. The neighbors saw him as a polite man, always willing to help, but the walls of that house told a different story. At night, Grace would wake to noises coming from the kitchen, slow footsteps, the muffled sounds of drawers being opened, and though she tried to believe they were just ordinary noises, the discomfort became impossible to ignore. Eli, for his part, felt the weight of his stepfather's silence. He was an observant, sensitive boy, the kind who understood what adults pretended not to see. He drew a lot, almost always solitary scenes, figures standing still in long shadows. Grace kept all the drawings in a box, unable to understand why her son seemed to see the world through shades of gray. In the weeks leading up to the birthday, Marcus showed an unusual interest in preparing for the party. He wanted to take care of everything himself, the decorations, the guest list, and especially the cake. Grace found his sudden enthusiasm strange, but felt grateful. She believed it was an attempt at rapprochement between stepfather and stepson, And perhaps that's why she ignored the signs. The day before the party, Eli had said he didn't want to celebrate. "The house isn't happy," he whispered to his mother before going to sleep. Grace hugged him, trying to comfort him, and promised nothing bad would happen. But as the boy fell asleep, Marcus's gaze, reflected in the bedroom mirror, seemed to carry a secret. The next morning, as the sun streamed through the curtains and the sweet smell of frosting filled the air, Eli woke silently. He knew something had changed, something that couldn't be undone. And as the voices approached, bringing the sounds of children and the joyful music of the party, a strange sensation filled the house. It was as if the walls were listening, as if the very air held a truth no one dared speak. But the true omen would not come from the words, but from the boy's small gestures, who would begin to repeat something that no one was prepared to understand. In the days following the party, something changed in awe. The previously silent boy became almost a specter within his own home. He would sit for long minutes on the edge of his bed, staring blankly into space, as if waiting for an answer that never came. Sometimes he would draw. Other times he would simply listen to the sound of the wind blowing against the windows, as if trying to decipher messages the rest of the world ignored. His drawings began to change. There were no more trees or colorful houses, just the outline of a cake split in half with something dark inside. On every page, that same pattern, the same drawing, the same empty look of a child who has seen too much. Grace found him one morning sitting on his bedroom floor with dozens of leaves scattered. "About?" She asked what it meant, and he replied weakly, barely moving his lips, "The cake is sick, Mom. It needs to be thrown away." Grace, overcome with a mixture of fear and compassion, tried to mask her concern. She said it was all just her imagination, that her son was just nervous about the presence of so many people at the party. But inside, something in her was also beginning to crumble. The boy's expression wasn't one of fantasy, it was certainty. Marcus, upon noticing the drawings, reacted with irritation. He said it was drama and that the child needed discipline. He grabbed a few sheets of paper and tore them up in front of the boy, demanding that he stop drawing this morbid nonsense. Eli remained silent, watching the pieces of paper fall to the floor, unblinking. Then, calmly, he picked up one of the fragments and put it in his pocket, as if guarding a truth no one wants to hear. That night, Grace woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She got up and saw Eli's room lit by a small flashlight. The boy was kneeling, drawing on the floor with white chalk. In the center of the drawing was the same cake, but now there was something new, a tall shadow behind him, with long hands and the outline of empty eyes. When his mother asked what it was, he replied in a cold, almost mechanical tone, "That's whoever put the thing in there." Grace's heart raced. She erased the drawing with a cloth and carried her son to bed, trying to ignore the chill that ran down her spine. As she held him close, she heard him murmur one last sentence before falling asleep. "He promised me that the cake was to make me forget what he did." Grace stood still, unable to react. The wind outside seemed to blow stronger, and the entire house groaned under the weight of silence. The next morning, the strange smell filled the kitchen again, and this time, even the adults began to sense that there was something deeply wrong in that house. The next morning, the house of Carteret seemed enveloped by a different, almost thick air, as if something invisible hovered over every room. The sweet, heavy smell of frosting still wafted through the kitchen, but there was a new odor no one could quite place. It wasn't the aroma of stale cake or burnt sugar. It was something denser, metallic, reminiscent of rust mixed with something alive. Grace, opening the window, felt her stomach churn, but chose not to comment. It was as if, by naming it, the fear became real. Marcus, indifferent, drank coffee with his face buried in the newspaper. He pretended not to notice his wife's restless gaze and the fact that the boy hadn't touched his breakfast plate. Eli just stared at the switched-off stove, the empty chair beside the table, and the cake still covered in foil on the counter. When Grace asked if he wanted a piece, the boy just shook his head and muttered, "I'll have some." He's still in there. Grace tried to laugh, but it quickly died away. The sound seemed too echoing, and even the dog, usually calm, began barking, staring at the cake. The animal, who never climbed onto the table, now growled softly, its fur bristling, its eyes fixed on the silver platter. Marcus stood up irritably, shooed the animal away, and with a brusque gesture threw the cake lid in the trash, declaring it childish superstition and the drama of a tired woman. But the cake remained there, so perfect, as if time had not affected it. No flies, no sign of decay, just that still. White frosting, which now seemed to be watching back. Grace, as she washed the dishes, had the feeling that the reflection in the window showed something different. A shadow behind the cake, still, tall, like a silhouette. She turned around immediately. There was nothing. Still, the image stuck in her mind. That night, the sounds began. First, the faint sound of silverware clanging, as if someone was stirring in the kitchen. Then, the creaking of wood, the hiss of the refrigerator, and an almost human sound, slow, drawn-out breathing that seemed to come from the walls. Grace went downstairs, turning on the lights, but everything stopped the moment she entered the room. Only the clock ticked toward dawn. When he returned to the room, he found Eli awake, sitting up in bed, his eyes wide open. He asked in a cold voice, "Did you hear that too, Mom? He's still hungry?" Grace hugged him, unable to respond. Outside, the wind blew hard, swaying the trees, and for a second, she swore she heard muffled laughter mingling with the night sound. And it was at that point that silent fear turned to suspicion. Someone finally decided to take a closer look, but what they would find inside that house would only be the beginning of something much worse. That morning, the sun seemed to hesitate before passing through the windows of the house. Carter, as if even the light avoided touching that heavy atmosphere. The air was thick, and the metallic smell that had previously seemed merely an annoyance had now become part of the routine, permeating the walls, the curtains, and the minds of everyone who breathed inside. Grace, exhausted, decided to ask for help. She no longer knew if what she felt was fear, madness, or simply guilt for having ignored her son's instincts. Their neighbor, the old man Sr. Miller, was known in the neighborhood for his practical manner and calm in any situation. When she called asking him to stop by, he arrived immediately, carrying a flashlight and a curious look. Upon entering, he looked around and realized something wasn't right. There was an almost oppressive stillness, the kind of silence that precedes a revelation. Grace tried to explain what was happening, but her words came out shaky, as if they didn't want to exist. Marcus, sitting at the table with an impatient expression, constantly interrupted, saying it was woman's drama and that the boy needed correction, not attention. Mr. Miller asked permission to take a look. He walked into the kitchen, studying the cake on the counter as if contemplating an otherworldly object. The frosting still glistened in the dim light, untouched, far too beautiful for something made days ago. He approached, slowly bent down, and inhaled. His eyes drained of color instantly. He said nothing, just recovered the cake and stepped back, wiping the cloth on his sweaty forehead. Grace watched him silently, sensing he knew more than he admitted. "Is everything okay?" she asked in a whisper. The man hesitated before answering. "Maybe it's best to throw it away," he murmured, avoiding her eyes. Marcus laughed loudly, as if trying to reassert control of the house, and said that, "You don't waste an expensive cake because of the smell." Mr. Miller lowered his eyes, without arguing. and glanced discreetly at Eli, who was regarding him with the seriousness of someone carrying a secret. Approaching him, he asked him quietly, "Did you see anything being put there, boy?" The boy took a while to answer. His lips moved slowly, and what came out was almost a lament. "I saw, but he doesn't want me to talk." The neighbor turned pale, pretended not to hear, and hurried off, promising to return later, a promise he would never keep. That night, the silence was broken by the sound of a knife being struck against a wooden board. Grace jumped up, startled, but stood still in the darkness, listening to the sound repeat itself, measured and cold, coming from the kitchen. And it was in that instant that fear took shape. The sign that would come soon after would show that the nightmare surrounding that house did not come from the boy's mind, but from something that was really there, pulsing in the darkness. The dawn seemed endless. The wind beat against the windows as if trying to get in, and the sound of the kitchen knife continued, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Grace. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching the shadowed room, her heart racing and her breath shallow. Every metallic clang echoed down the hallway like a warning. Something was happening down there, something she didn't want to know but needed to know. She gathered her courage and descended slowly, avoiding the creaking stairs. The house was cold, filled with dense darkness. In the middle of the kitchen, the refrigerator light flickered intermittently, illuminating fragments of the room in short intervals. It was then that she saw him. Marcus. He stood at the counter, his back turned, moving the knife over the cake with slow, measured movements. His body trembled, but it didn't look like fear. It was as if he were concentrating, engaged in a silent ritual. "Marcus, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He continued cutting through the frosting as if searching for something inside, plunging the blade deeper and deeper, oblivious to the metallic sound the knife made as it touched the porcelain plate. When he finally turned around, his gaze was distant, his face pale and sweaty. "I'm just checking," he said, his tone low, almost emotionless. Grace took a step back. The refrigerator light went out, leaving the room completely dark for a second. When it came back on, Orr stood in the hallway, watching them both. The boy was trembling, but not crying. He walked to the table and, without saying a word, placed the notebook he'd been drawing in for weeks on it. He opened it to the last page. The drawing showed the cake cut in half, with something dark in the center. The same thing that now stood before them. But around it was another figure, Marcus with empty eyes, holding the knife, and above him a large, indistinct shadow from which a line of blood seemed to fall. The man looked at the paper and paled. For a moment, his lips moved as if to say something, but no words came out. Grace grabbed her son's arm, trying to protect him, but the boy didn't flinch. He simply said, his tone firm and eerily calm, "He doesn't want the cake cut again." A loud slap came from the refrigerator. The lights flickered. The cake began to crack in the center, the frosting splitting in thin lines as if something were trying to escape. Grace screamed, and Marcus, overcome with panic, threw the knife to the floor. The sound echoed like thunder inside the house. Eli covered his ears, his eyes fixed on the cake that now gave off an unbearable smell. The signal had been given. Fear had ceased to be a sensation. It had become a presence. The next morning, neighbors would be awakened by the sound of sirens, and what investigators would find in that kitchen would turn suspicion into horror and reveal that the evil lurking around the Carters had roots far older than anyone imagined. The dawn arrived without announcing the sun. A gray blanket covered the sky Maplewood, and the silence of the street contrasted with the chaos inside the house. Carter sirens broke the calm shortly after 6, echoing through the trees like a somber call. Neighbors crowded the sidewalk, whispering among themselves, while police officers hurried in, led by a pale Grace, her hands trembling and her eyes lost. The interior of the house seemed suspended in time. The sweet, cloying smell mixed with the metallic odor made some of the staff cover their faces. In the center of the kitchen, the cake remained on the counter, cracked, misshapen, but still there, as if resisting disappearance. The knife lying on the floor reflected the morning light, and a fly circled the frosting, landing and departing in slow intervals. The detective in charge of the case, Lieutenant Harris, observed everything in silence. He was an experienced man, accustomed to disturbing scenes, but there was something about that kitchen that disconcerted him. He had seen crimes, accidents, even rituals, but never a scene that seemed so conscious. The cake wasn't just an object. There was something about it that seemed to watch back. Grace was taken to the living room, where she answered questions in a weak voice. She recounted what she had heard, what she had seen, and repeatedly told him that her son had said he hadn't wanted the cake from the beginning. Marcus, meanwhile, was found in the backyard, sitting on the ground, his hands covered in frosting and a vacant stare, quietly repeating a single sentence. "I just wanted her to forgive me." Eli, silent, watched everything from the stairs. The boy didn't cry or tremble. He seemed to simply confirm what he'd known all along. When the detective approached and asked what he'd seen, his answer came cold and direct. "He put the thing in there at night when he thought I was asleep." Harris stared at him for a long time, intrigued by the boy's steadfastness. He ordered an expert to collect the cake and take it for analysis. The sound of camera flashes filled the room, each click recording a scene that seemed straight out of a nightmare. Hours later, when the cake was cut open in the lab, the truth began to emerge. Inside, investigators found a small package wrapped in plastic and duct tape, covered in icing residue and a dark substance. When opened, it revealed something that left the team speechless. Strands of human hair mixed with a piece of fabric and a gold chain with the name Rachel engraved in small letters. The name was enough to change the course of the investigation. Rachel was the name of Marcus's ex-wife, who had disappeared 2 years earlier. But discovering the name was only the first step. What lay behind that cursed cake was more than a crime. It was the echo of something that refused to die, a secret that was now finally beginning to be unearthed. The discovery of the name Rachel on the necklace was like a blade cutting through the heavy air of the laboratory. Lieutenant Harris, who had been calmly watching the experts work for minutes, felt a chill run down his spine when he heard the metallic sound of the chain hitting the stainless steel tray. The silence that fell after the discovery seemed weighty. None of the agents dared to express their thoughts, but in each of their eyes, the same conclusion was evident: that cake was no mere contaminated food. It was a tomb disguised as a celebration. Grace was called to identify the object. When the necklace was placed on the table, she clasped her hands over her mouth and fell to her knees. The golden glow reflected the name Rachel softly, almost innocently, but to her, it was a symbol of a nightmare. Rachel had only been mentioned a few times by Marcus, an ex-wife he claimed had fled due to debt and addiction. Grace had believed him, and now she felt the ground crumble beneath her feet as she realized that perhaps Rachel had never left. About that, or he remained outside the room, sitting silently in the laboratory hallway, watching everything through the glass window. His gaze was the same as before, calm, steady, almost too wise for a boy his age. When the detective approached and asked how he knew there was something in the cake, the boy answered without hesitation, "I saw him hiding it." He thought no one would notice, but the smell lingered in the house. Harris wrote it all down, but the way the boy spoke, slowly, precisely, without fear, made him uneasy. It seemed to be no ordinary memory, but something deeper, as if the boy had relived what he described. While the forensics team packed up the cake and necklace, Harris reviewed Marcus's history. He discovered that Rachel had disappeared suddenly 2 years earlier, and the case had been closed for lack of evidence. Her last known presence was in that city. After the divorce, the man had sold his old house, moved, and within 6 months, remarried to Grace. At the police station, the interrogation with Marcus was tense. He denied it, sweated and looked away, but with each new question his face grew paler, until, unprovoked, he muttered something that made the detective sit back in his chair in surprise. "I just wanted to get rid of the weight." She never left. "Me alone." Grace heard this from the other side of the glass and broke down. It was the first time Marcus had admitted what she'd feared since the discovery, and at the same time, it was confirmation of something even more terrifying. Eli knew from the beginning. But what no one expected was that Marcus's confession wouldn't be the end. That very night, new evidence would emerge, and with it, a revelation that would completely change the fate of everyone involved, including the boys, the police. Station clock was almost midnight when the interrogation of Marcus Carter was resumed. The room was cold, lit only by a pendant lamp whose gentle swaying cast moving shadows on the wall. The detective Harris, he kept his expression firm, but his gaze betrayed the discomfort the man caused. Marcus sat with his hands handcuffed, his eyes downcast, and his breathing irregular. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and his face, once rigid and proud, now displayed the weariness of someone carrying something impossible to hide any longer. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he murmured, staring into the distance. "It was an accident. She fell. She hit her head." Harris interrupted him, keeping his voice calm. "And so you decided to hide her inside a birthday cake?" Marcus looked up, and for a moment, a barely perceptible smile appeared on his face. It wasn't irony. It was desperation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "She wouldn't let me sleep. I saw her every night, standing in the hallway, staring at me. I heard her voice inside the walls. I had to do something." The detective leaned forward, attentive. "Rachel was dead, Marcus. What you saw was guilt, not a ghost." Marcus shook his head slowly. "No, it wasn't her fault. It was her. I felt her touch when I was making the cake. She wanted me to put on the necklace. She wanted me to confess. But I just wanted the noise to stop." As he spoke, tears began to stream down his face, and his voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. Harris realized this man wasn't just confessing to a crime. He was describing torment. The line between reality and delirium seemed to have blurred. In the observation room, Grace listened to everything, motionless, her face drained of color. The sound of Marcus's words echoed inside her, dismantling everything she thought she knew. Beside her, Orr watched with a distant, cold, almost adult look. When the detective finished his questions, the boy approached the glass and, in an instinctive gesture, placed his hand on the cold glass, as if he wanted to touch his father. Suddenly, Marcus glanced at the observation mirror, as if sensing the gesture. His gaze met the boy's, and for a moment, they both seemed caught in something greater than the moment itself. The air in the room seemed to constrict. Marcus stood up abruptly, shouting, "He was the one who reminded me. He brought her back." The boy never slept. He kept looking, always looking. The officers held him back. But the sentence hung in the air like a riddle. What did Marcus mean? That the boy knew before, that there was something about him that awakened the past. Hours later, as he was transferred to his cell, Marcus began humming a childish melody. The lyrics, confusing and repetitive, mentioned a party that never ended and a woman still waiting in the dark. When asked what it meant, he simply replied, "She's in the house. She's still there." At that very moment, Detective Harris's phone rang. On The other end, the expert responsible for searching the property, said something that chilled everyone's blood. Behind the kitchen wall, they found a small opening, sealed with old mortar and fabric scraps. When they removed the rubble, they discovered what appeared to be a second necklace, identical to the first, and nail marks in the wood. Grace collapsed. Eli remained silent, staring at the ground, his eyes watery, but not crying. When Harris bent down to speak to him, the boy only murmured, "I told you she hadn't left." She was still there, waiting for him to finish the cake. The detective swallowed hard. The silence that followed was absolute. No sound, no movement, only the distant crackle of neon lights, as if even electricity hesitated to remain in that place. And in that early morning, when the truth came out, no one realized that something had still been left behind. A forgotten detail that, when revealed days later, would prove that the Carter household would never be able to shake off what happened there. The days following the confession were filled with a strange silence in Maplewood. The news spread through the city like a cold wave, reaching every corner, every neighbor who had once praised Marcus Carter's smile. The house of Carter, now cordoned off by yellow tape, had become a symbol of horror and curiosity. Children avoided walking past it, and adults, without even admitting it, would change sides of the street when the wind blew toward the kitchen. Marcus was taken to state prison, awaiting trial. During preliminary hearings, he maintained the same blank stare and the same confused discourse about voices and presences. His lawyers pleaded insanity, but to Grace, it mattered little. The man she'd shared her bed with for 2 years had never existed. He'd been a shadow, a mask built on guilt and fear. Grace, she tried to move on with her life, but the house wouldn't let her. No matter how much the agents cleaned the place and removed all traces, the smell lingered. She would wake in the middle of the night hearing footsteps, clanging cutlery, and sometimes the soft sound of a woman singing an old song. I couldn't sleep in the same bed anymore. I spent the early morning sitting in the living room, watching the candle flame flicker, praying that her son wouldn't feel the same way. But Eli felt it. Since the day everything came to light, the boy had become more introspective, more distant, as if carrying a weight no one could share. Sometimes, he could be seen in the backyard, sitting in front of the turned earth, talking to himself. When Grace asked him what he was doing, he would answer with unsettling serenity, "I hear her leaving." Time passed, but peace never returned. Marcus died months later, found hanged in his cell. The note he left behind contained only one sentence: "Now the cake is complete." That sentence was the final blow that destroyed the little piece that remained. Years later, when everyone believed the case had been forgotten, Eli would return to that house, and what he would find inside would prove that certain ghosts don't disappear. They just learn to wait for the right moment to make themselves heard again. The years passed, but time did not take away what was recorded in awe. He was no longer the frightened boy trembling before a cake. Now he was a young man with a distant look in his eyes, marked by a precocious maturity and a silence that no adult could understand. After Marcus's death, Grace tried to rebuild his life away from Maplewood, but the weight of memories followed them like a faithful shadow. The boy grew up in different cities, changed schools several times, but the past continued to call to him in dreams that never ceased. One night, many years later, an unexpected phone call brought back everything he had tried to forget. The Carter's old house, now abandoned, was to be demolished. Upon hearing the news, Eli stood still for a long time, the phone still in his hand, as if he needed it to say goodbye once and for all. The next morning, he returned alone to Maplewood. The gate creaked as if recalling the sound of his childhood. The yard was covered in dry leaves, and the house was filled with dust and the sluggish smell of the past. He walked slowly to the kitchen, the very place where it all began, and stopped at the counter, where afternoon light filtered in through the dirty windows. The silence seemed to be watching him. On the table, he found something that made him hold his breath. A little plate with a small piece of hardened cake covered in a fine layer of dust. The cake sat there untouched, as if time had stood still since that day. Beside it, a partially burned candle. Eli sat at the table and lit the candle. The flame danced slowly, reflecting in his eyes. "I still remember, Mother," he whispered. For a moment, the air in the kitchen seemed to shift. The fire flickered as if an invisible breeze were passing, and in the reflection of the window pane, he swore he saw a female silhouette behind him, still serene, as if smiling. Eli closed his eyes, allowing the memory to wash over him. But when the flame went out on its own, the silence that remained was not just an absence of sound. It was as if the house had finally exhaled its last breath, taking with it the secret that should never have been revealed. QAs, the candle flame died. Darkness filled the kitchen with the delicacy of a veil, covering the face of someone who no longer wishes to be seen. The silence that descended seemed to have a life of its own, breathing through the cracks in the ancient walls, seeping into the air like a whisper held back for decades. Every corner of the house seemed to exude memories. Fragments of voices, footsteps, laughter that time had swallowed but never completely erased. Eli sat for a few moments, watching the wisp of smoke rise in slow spirals, as if it were the last soul leaving the place. The flame had died, but something inside him seemed to awaken, as if that darkness brought more light than the day itself. Outside, the wind began to blow with increasing force, vibrating the windows with a sound reminiscent of ancient laments. The dry leaves in the yard danced in swirls that seemed to follow an invisible choreography, and amidst the whistling of the wind, Eli heard the distant echo of a song, a soft, feminine, almost maternal voice singing the same melody that had lulled him to sleep in his childhood. It was a song without lyrics, but charged with memory, the kind only the heart recognizes. He closed his eyes for a moment and allowed the sound to wash over him, mixing nostalgia and pain, remembering his mother calling him from the window, the smell of bread in the oven, the peaceful afternoons before everything became a cursed secret. He stood up slowly, running his hand over the counter where, so many years before, fear had taken shape. The touch of the worn wood was like a reunion between past and present. That same counter where his mother trembled holding the knife, where his stepfather lied and smiled, where the cake rested with something hidden beneath the white frosting. Now, time had petrified everything. The place, once a symbol of horror, had become nothing more than a memory. And memories, when faced head-on, cease to frighten and begin to teach. The house, finally empty, seemed peaceful. The walls, once imbued with fear, now exuded a strange calm, as if the space were grateful to finally be visited one last time, to have its silence broken, to witness the end of a cycle. Eli looked around and realized that nothing remained but traces of a history the world had tried to forget. The table still stood there, covered in dust, the petrified cake resting like a grotesque sculpture from a distant time, the candle reduced to a small stub of hardened wax. He approached and touched the cake, feeling the roughness of its dried surface beneath his fingers, as if the object carried, within its very substance, the weight of the revelations that nearly destroyed his childhood. For a moment, he imagined the scene as if he were an outside spectator. The boy, motionless, his terrified gaze on his face, the distraught mother, the stepfather, disguising his guilt behind a mask of tenderness. And then he understood. The evil wasn't in the cake, nor in the house. The evil was the silence that protected the guilty, that suffocated the truth, that turned fear into routine and innocence into vigilance. Eli, now an adult, realized that his entire life had been an attempt to erase that day when he learned that danger can lurk behind a smile and that the darkest secrets hide not in basements, but in gazes. He turned toward the door, taking a deep breath, as if saying goodbye to an old acquaintance. The wind through the window ruffled the curtains, and for a brief second, he thought he saw a shadow move. A feminine silhouette standing beside the table, looking at him sweetly. It was the kind of sight only those who have suffered understand, a mixture of longing and forgiveness. Eli was unafraid. He smiled slightly with a serene weariness and whispered something that the wind carried with it, perhaps a thank you, perhaps a goodbye. As he stepped through the doorway, the evening light enveloped him, tinging the air with orange and gold hues. The wind blew once more, extinguishing what remained of the flame, and the shadow of the house slowly dissolved into the horizon. Each step Eli took on the dirt road seemed to distance him not only from the place, but also from the weight he had carried for so many years. He knew that some houses aren't just buildings, they are witnesses. And some witnesses, no matter how much they try to remain silent, always find a way to tell what they saw. As he walked, the memory of a phrase echoed in his mind, a memory that perhaps belonged to his mother, or to some voice that time had kept among the echoes of childhood. When a child is afraid, the danger is already inside the home. These words followed him to the end of the road, echoing amidst the distant sound of branches and the rustling of leaves. The sun was sinking behind the trees, and Eli's figure, now just a silhouette on the horizon, blended into the twilight. The past had finally been buried, but not forgotten, because some truths never die. They just wait for the right moment to be heard. And then, as the camera slowly pulls away, the narration emerges low and paused, with the same tone that marks the end of one story and the beginning of another. If this story touched you, subscribe now. There are truths that only come to light when we decide to listen to the silence. And here, the silence always has something to say.